Now, a veteran economist, Saul Eslake, has been a critic of the generosity of negative gearing property tax concessions for about 4 decades now, certainly for longer than Max Chandler Mather's been around in politics. We got his analysis on how and why changes could be made. Saul joined us from Hobart a short time ago. Saul Eslake, it's so good to have you back with us again on the program. We might pull some numbers apart on negative gearing in just a moment. Can we start, though, with something that you're good at, even if it doesn't require a background in economics, which is the politics. What politics of property tax concessions used by 1.3 million Australians at present? Are there votes to be found here, do you think?
Well, yes, there are, in the sense that almost 20% of tax-paying Australians have an investment property. That's an extraordinarily high proportion by international standards, and one of the reasons why they have an investment property is that Australia's tax system, almost uniquely among developed countries, says that you're a mug if you don't. If you have enough cash flow to absorb interest costs being higher than your net rental income, our tax system allows you both to defer and permanently reduce the amount of tax you would otherwise have to pay on your wage and salary or other income. And so almost a fifth of tax-paying Australians do it, which means there are a lot of votes in keeping it, and there are potentially a lot of votes to be lost in arguing that it should be abolished, except that opinion polls suggest that a growing proportion of Australians, one suggested a majority of Australians, now see that abolishing or curtailing negative gearing might be one way, not the only way, not the sole solution, but one way of addressing Australia's growing housing crisis.
And that might be, Saul, why the government is kind of letting that kite fly, at least for the time being. We don't know how long it will remain aloft. But let's look at the numbers. An across-the-board end to negative gearing on investment properties and capital gains tax concessions, which was costed by the Greens. This is like the most extreme version, roughly speaking $160 billion over a decade. Bill Shorten's version, $35 billion over a decade. Does this have to be worthwhile financially on the budget to warrant the government going there, as they say?
Well, that wouldn't be the primary reason for doing it. The primary reason for doing it would be the help it would provide in addressing Australia's housing crisis. And again, I emphasise it's not a magic bullet. It wouldn't be the only thing that governments could or should do to make housing more affordable, especially for people who want to own their own homes, as a majority of Australians, I think, still do. But it would also make a useful contribution to addressing another problem which Australia has, which, as the most recent budget papers reveal, structural budget deficits over at least the next decade. Indeed, the intergenerational report released last year said structural budget deficits for the next 40 years. And abolishing negative gearing for investors in established properties and reducing the capital gains tax discount would make a worthwhile contribution to solving that problem as well.
All right, you're making the argument there, so that the revenue gained should be specifically hypothecated or directed towards housing supply and housing affordability measures. In what way? Elaborate on that.
Well, I'm not necessarily saying that. The Greens are. I think some of the revenue that would be gained by making those changes should be applied to reducing the budget deficit. But it could certainly be used in part to allow the federal government to give more money to the states so that they can build more social housing than they're already intending to do. It could also be used to bribe or cajole the states into improving their zoning and planning laws so that the cost of building new housing by the private sector, especially in places where people want to live, close to places of employment, would be less expensive or indeed more possible than it is under current zoning and planning laws in many of Australia's states.
All right. Do you see merit in a limited or modest set of proposals here? One that caps the amount of deductions that a taxpayer might make on their investment property, or alternatively caps the number of properties that investor might own?
Well, personally, I'd like the government to go further than that, but unlike the Greens, I don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and these would be worthwhile steps that would help alleviate Australia's housing crisis, as well as providing some useful additional revenue for a budget that's in structural deficit. So while I'd personally like the government to go further, these are very much steps in the right direction, which I would applaud.
Do you buy the argument, Saul, that Treasury would just routinely be examining these things without a specific mandate to do so, having been issued by the government?
To be honest, I don't know. I mean, Treasury does from time to time serve up options to the government for achieving what it thinks are the government's overall objectives, and more often than not, those suggestions are knocked back by the government of the day for political reasons. But Treasury has certainly done work on this before. We know that it did while Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister and Scott Morrison was Treasurer. They got rolled by Matthias Cormann and Peter Dutton in Cabinet. We know that. For political reasons, and presumably the coalition under Mr Dutton's leadership would take the same stance if this were to become contested territory ahead of the next election. But the key difference, of course, is that it would be the government who are putting forward this proposal for scaling back in some way negative gearing rather than an opposition. And history tells us that it's much more difficult for an opposition to advocate a reform that might cost some votes, because the government of the day, whoever it is, will use all the vastly greater powers they have at their disposal to scare the living daylights out of the voting public, as Paul Keating successfully did in 1993 and as Scott Morrison successfully did in 2019. Yeah. But if the government is pushing the argument with all the resources government has behind it, then I think it has a much better chance of success than it did in 2016 and 2019.
Good point, and they got away with that in January of this year with the Stage 3 tax cut makeover. One final question, slightly technical, Saul. It's like, what happens to the share market if the government only moved on property-related capital gains? Do you need to make adjustments there too on capital gains so that money doesn't just go hunting property and it diverts entirely into shares?
I think it would be unfair if the government were to preclude negative gearing only for property investments. And that would actually strengthen the argument of the property industry against making that change, because they would be right to say that it was unfair. It was singling them out. I think negative gearing should be scaled back for all types of investment, with the possible exception of investment in new housing, because we do actually need to stimulate investment in new housing. It's worth remembering in that context that over 75% of lending to investors for the purchase of property goes to the purchase of established housing, not new housing. And all that does is drive up the price of the housing we already have and deprive would-be first home buyers of buying homes that they can then live in. In other words, property interests say that negative gearing is essential to increasing the supply of housing. When investors buy established housing, yes, they're creating a supply of rental housing by creating additional demand for it, by outbidding would-be first home buyers. So to claim that you need to keep negative gearing or rents will go through the roof, and allegedly that's what happened in 1985 through 87, is just, no pun intended, an urban myth.
All right. I was just going to wrap it up there, Saul. I was going to say we have a debate up and running, not for the first time. Let's see how long this particular version runs for, and I dare say it's not the last conversation we'll have on the matter. Saul Eslake, thanks so much.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, Greg.